Dalioka, standing in Orton, was looking to some unspecific distance, honestly uninterested. "I've never felt you act this way before," said Michelle unsteadily, looking down, suddenly tired and scared. The protest of her having dispersed to something negotiable. For a few days, 2 or 3 months ago, she had considered studying abroad in Barcelona next spring, which would have meant 4 months apart. Paul thought of how they'd kept delaying buying plane tickets to visit his parents in Taiwan. In December, which was next month, he knew, as if in tacit understanding, that the relationship wouldn't last that long. Paul felt himself trying to interpret the situation, as if there was a problem to be solved, but there didn't seem to be anything, or maybe there was, but he was 3 or 4 skill sets away from comprehension, like an amoeba trying to create a personal web page using CSS. "I'm just naturally losing interest," he finally said, a little improvisationally, and Michelle began quietly crying. "I didn't expect this at all," she said. "I felt good about us the past 2 weeks. I thought we've been closer than we've ever been." "I think it was affected by the study abroad thing," said Paul, nearly inaudibly, confused how she thought they'd been close the past 2 weeks. "Go back to the party. I'll talk to you tomorrow." "Wait, I don't think we should leave each other now." "Have a good time with your friends," said Michelle sincerely. "Wait, what friends?" "We'll talk tomorrow," said Michelle. "If we leave each other now, it's over." "It doesn't have to be like that." "I only go to things to find a girlfriend," said Paul, paraphrasing himself, and they stood not looking at each other for 1 or 2 minutes, as rain from faraway places disappeared into their clothing and hair. Paul felt surprised by the friendly tone of his voice, as he asked if Michelle wanted to eat dinner with him in a restaurant. "I don't want to talk to you right now," said Michelle. "I don't want to be in a relationship where it's like this." "I don't either," said Michelle. "I'm going back if you don't want to do something." "I want to go home. Good night." "Okay," said Paul, and turned around, aware they hadn't parted like this before. He crossed 22nd Street and turned to cross 10th Avenue, and saw Michelle disjunctively running and walking towards him, stopping at a red light with the posture of a depressed teenager. Paul thought of how she liked Nirvana a lot, and she crossed the street, showing as she neared and stopping within an arm's reach. "Paul," she said after a few seconds, and touched his upper arm as if to offer a way back through her to some prior intimacy, from where they could tunnel carefully elsewhere, or to the same place, but with a kind of skill this time, having practiced once. Paul remained still, unsure what to say or think. Michelle lowered her hand to her side. "What are you doing?" she said, somewhat defensively. "What do you mean?" "Aren't you going back to the party?" "Yeah, I said I was." "Fine," said Michelle. Paul felt passively committed to not moving. "Why are you standing here?" "You came back," said Paul feebly, and 4 to 6 people approached from the direction of the party. Michelle stepped into a soily area, lower and darker than the sidewalk, and leaned between spires on a metal fence, with her left profile obscured by her long dark hair. Toward Paul, who stared dumbly at the gently convex curve of her back, thinking with theoretical detachment that should console her, and that maybe the discomfort of her forearms against the thin metal of the fence had created a location, accessible only to herself, towards which she could relocate, away from what she felt, and a kind of shrinking. "Do you," said Paul, and coughed twice with his mouth closed, "do you want to eat dinner with me somewhere?" Michelle turned towards him a little, moving her head to see through her hair. "What are you doing?" she said in a tired, distracted voice, and leaned back on the fence without waiting for an answer. After a vague amount of time, Paul heard himself asking again if she wanted to eat dinner with him, at the green table, one of the few restaurants they wanted to but hadn't tried. Then she was walking away, her long legs scissor-like in their little, orderly movements. It would take her thousands of steps to get anywhere, but she would get there easily, and when she arrived, in the present, it would seem like it had been a single movement that brought her there. Did existence ever seem worked for? One simply to be here, less an accumulation of moments in a single arrangement continuously gifted from some inaccessible future. As Michelle became smaller, then out of view, Paul distantly sensed the implication, from his previous thoughts, which he had mostly forgotten, that the universe in its entirety was a message to itself to not feel bad, an ever-elaborating languageless rhetoric against feeling bad, and he was troubled by this, suspecting that his thoughts and intentions at some point, in April or May, or years ago, in a college or as a child, had been wrong, but he had continued in that wrongness, and was now distanced from some correct beginning to a degree that the universe, and himself, a part of the universe, was articulately against him. In his tiredness and in attention, these institutions manifested in Paul as an uncomplicated feeling of bleakness, that he was in the centre of something bad, whose confines were expanding, as he remained in the same place. Faintly he recognised in this a kind of humour, but mostly he was aware of the rain, continuous and everywhere, as an incognisable information as he crossed the magnified street gleaming in blacker from wetness to return to the party. Michelle's absence in Taiwan was mentioned once at dinner with 8 to 12 relatives a week into Paul's visit, when Paul's father, 61, characteristically without prompting or context, loudly joked that Paul's girlfriends always left him, then laughed in an uncontrollable seeming, closed-eye, almost Winston manner. Paul's mother, 57, responded with aggravation that the opposite was true and that Paul's father should lie recklessly. She said in Mandarin. Paul hadn't seen his parents since they sold their house in Florida a year and a half ago and moved back to Taiwan. After almost 30 years in America, into a 14th-floor apartment in a rapidly developing area of Taipei, with 2 guest rooms that his mother had recently stressed were Paul's room and Paul's brother's room. Paul thought his parents looked the same, but he viewed his mother, who had been diagnosed as pre-diabetic, a little differently. Maybe is finally past middle age, though not yet elderly. Her emails, the past 8 months, had frequently mentioned, as sort of asides or reminders, to herself mostly, that she was using less sugar in her daily coffee, but really shouldn't be using any. Her most emphasised message to her family, the past 2 decades, in Paul's view, was the importance of health to a happy life, though her doctor had said the amount she used was okay, and on days without sugar in her coffee, which was decaf, she felt empty, like something is missing, she had said in one email. When one afternoon Paul saw her putting sugar in her coffee, it seemed to them both like she'd been caught doing something wrong. She blushed and briefly focused self-consciously on stirring her coffee with a little spoon. Then she looked at Paul, and her mouth reflexively opened in an endearingly childlike, self-conscious, almost mischievous display of guilt and shame and repentance that Paul recognised from the rare times he'd seen her do things she told him not to do, such as eat food that had fallen on the floor. After grinning, Paul obligatorily said something negative about sugar, that everyone, not only diabetic, should avoid it. His mother's expression resolved to the controlled smirk and wryly satisfied demeanour of an adult who was slightly more amused than embarrassed to have been caught ideally succumbing to a meagre comfort that they've openly disapproved of for themselves and others. Paul unintentionally caught his mother using sugar 2 more times the next 2 weeks, resulting in similar but less intense reactions and outcomes. The 24-ounce organic raw agave nectar he had mailed her, believing it was the safest sweetener for diabetics, had been opened but not used, it seemed, more than once or twice. His 4th week in Taiwan, one more week than planned, his mother began encouraging him 2 or 3 times a day, with a slightly affected strategic nonchalance, Paul felt, to move to Taiwan for 1 year to teach English. She mentioned Ernest Hemingway more than once while saying Paul would benefit as a writer from the interesting experience. Paul said he would benefit by being in America, where he could speak the language and maintain friendships and do things. He said in Mandarin, visualizing himself on his back, on his yoga mat, with his MacBook on the inclined surface of his thighs, formed by bending his knees, looking at the internet. His parents had encouraged him to stay a 5th week, which with some difficulty he decided against, thinking it excessive, after which, his last few days in Taiwan, his mother began to stress that he should visit every December from now on, stating it as a fact, then making a noise meaning right. Paul's responses ranged from Mayberry to neutral to annoyed noises, to an explanation of why the more she pressured him, the less influence she'd have on his decisions. At the airport, Paul's mother stayed with Paul until she wasn't allowed farther without a ticket. She pointed at her eyes and said they were watery. Paul was required, she said in Mandarin with mock sternness, to visit next December. In the terminal, sitting with eyes closed, Paul imagined moving along to Taipei at an age like 51, where maybe he'd have cycled through enough friendships and relationships to not want more. Because his Mandarin wasn't fluent enough for conversations with strangers, and wasn't close to his relatives, with whom attempts at communication were brief and unadvancing and often koan-like, ending usually with one person looking away, ostensibly for assistance, and leaving, he'd be preemptively estranged, secretly unfriendable. The unindividualized shifting mass of everyone else would be a screen, distributed throughout the city, onto which he'd project the movie of his uninterrupted imagination, because he'd appear to, and be able to pretend he was, never actually be a part of the mass. Maybe he'd gradually begin to feel a kind of needless intimacy, not unlike being in the same room as a significant other and feeling affection without touching or speaking. And in a assembling of the backup life he'd stretched and constructed the blueprints and substructures for, during the average of 6 weeks per year, spread throughout his life, that he'd been in Taiwan, would begin at some point, after which months or years later, one morning, he would sense the independent organisation of a second iterant consciousness, lured here by the new unoccupied structures towards which he'd begin sending the data of his sensory perception, The antlered splashing, water-treading land animal of his first consciousness would sink to some lower region, in the lake of himself, where he would sometimes descend in sleep and experience his disintegrating particles, inferred pieces brushing past, in dreams, as it disappeared in the pattern of the nearest functioning system. On the plain, after a cup of black coffee, Paul thought of Taipei as a fifth season, or otherworld, outside or in equal contrast with his increasingly familiar and self-consciously repetitive life in America, where it seemed like the seasons, connecting in right angles, for some misguided reason, had formed a square, sarcastically framing nothing. Or being melded, Paul vaguely imagined, about an hour later, face down on his arms, on his dining tray, into a door knocker, which a child, after 20-30 knocks, no longer expecting an answer, has continued using, in a kind of daze, distracted by the pointlessness of his activity, looking absently elsewhere, unaware when he will abruptly, idly stop.